Okay, so the name of the land of Sogdiana and of the Sogdian people has been known, of course, since antiquity. In the West, Sogdiana became familiar to the Greeks as a result of its conquest by Alexander in the 4th century BCE. In the East, contacts between China and Sogdiana are known to have begun by the 2nd century BCE at the latest, and they continued to the end of the Tang dynasty and beyond, when the Sogdians were well known to the Chinese as a race of merchants. In both China and the West, the classical texts continued to be read, and thus the name of the Sogdians was never forgotten. But their language, which had formerly been widely spoken along the trade routes linking China and the West, had disappeared almost completely. How do I do this? That's right. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to give this talk to an audience, at least partly in Samarkand, the principal city of ancient Sogdiana, and in a series marking the centenary of the birth of V.A. Lifshitz, one of the great specialists in the language and history of the Sogdian people, as you've already been told. In particular, the name of Lifshitz will always be associated with the decipherment and interpretation of the manuscripts from Mount Mug in Tajikistan, the most important Sogdian documents to be found in the Sogdian homeland, which will be the subject of Franz Granet's talk next week. I had the privilege to meet Vladimir Aronovich several times in Russia, in England, and on one memorable occasion in Samarkand, when I joined him and Sergei Klyashony in a visit to the sauna. For a preliminary orientation, here is one of the many possible maps of the Silk Road, on which we can see Samarkand, the Chinese capital cities of Chang'an and Luoyang, and some of the important places in between where the Sogdians settled, including Turfan and Dunhuang, where most of the surviving Sogdian manuscripts were found. The rediscovery of Sogdian began in a small way with the partial decipherment of the Sogdian legends on the pre-Islamic coins of Bukhara by the German-Russian scholar Peter Lech in the 1860s and 1870s. He made his results known at the Third International Congress of Orientalists in St. Petersburg in 1876. Lech seems to have been the first to use the name Sogdian for the writing on these coins, and his decipherment of the legend was at least partially correct. In particular, he recognized that the first word is the name of the city Bukhara, and that the second word is a Sogdian word for lord or ruler, though we now know that his reading of some letters was erroneous. Unfortunately, the inscriptions on the coins of Bukhara were too short to provide any significant knowledge of the Sogdian language. The next discovery was much more substantial, though poorly preserved Sogdian monument, the trilingual inscription of Karabalgasun in Mongolia, which was discovered in 1889. We now know that the three languages of this inscription are Chinese, Runic Turkish, and Sogdian, and that the text commemorates the military campaigns and other achievements of the Uyghur Khagans of the 8th to 9th centuries. In particular, the adoption of Manichaeism as their state religion during the reign of the third Khagan. In recent years, the inscription has been intensively studied and its content is beginning to be well understood. However, the fact that the third version was in Sogdian was not recognized until 1909. Until then, the Sogdian version was thought to be Turkish, written in Uyghur script, so it played no part in the rediscovery and decipherment of Sogdian. The real beginning of Sogdian studies came as a result of the exploration of the Turfan Oasis. The existence of ancient ruins and manuscript fragments in the Turfan area first became known as the result of a series of Russian expeditions beginning in 1879. In the mid-1890s, one of these expeditions brought back to St. Petersburg a few samples of manuscript fragments. These happened to include a Sogdian fragment from Toyok, but it could not be read at that time and seems not to have aroused any special interest. In fact, it remained unpublished for more than 80 years. Nevertheless, scholars in several countries did take note of the Russian reports of pre-Islamic antiquities in the Turfan oasis, and a number of expeditions were planned as a result. The most significant of these were the 4 German Turfan expeditions, the first of which took place in 1902 to 1903. The finds of this expedition included a substantial number of manuscript fragments in a script which was then unknown, but which obviously derived from Aramaic and in many ways resembled the Estrangelo variety of Syriac script. The new script was quickly deciphered by Friedrich Wilhelm Karl Müller, who published his first results in 2 articles in 1904. These results were sensational. Not only had Müller succeeded in deciphering the script and reading it almost without error, but he was also able to establish that the fragments represented the literary remains of the Manichaean religion, a literature which until then had been regarded as lost forever, so that the beliefs of the Manichaeans were only known very imperfectly from the polemical writings of the Christian Church Fathers and other opponents. In addition, Müller recognized that the Manichaean manuscripts from Turfan were written in several different languages, including Turkish, Middle Persian, New Persian, and another Iranian language, which he provisionally referred to as a Middle Persian dialect. One of the manuscripts which Müller published in 1904 was a bilingual text in normal Middle Persian. Can everyone please mute themselves? Can people mute themselves, please? One of the manuscripts which Müller published in 1904 was a bilingual text in normal Middle Persian and this Middle Persian dialect. In fact, a passage from a work by the prophet Mani himself, the Living Gospel. As we now know, the Middle Persian dialect was Sogdian, and so this was the first Sogdian text to be published. Moreover, as well as publishing the text in transcription, Müller was able to make a preliminary attempt at translating it and commenting on the grammatical forms, greatly assisted by the existence of a parallel text in Middle Persian, a language which was already known from the Zoroastrian Pahlavi literature and which bore an easily recognizable relationship to modern Persian. On the basis of this publication, I think one may regard 1904 as the foundation year of Sogdian studies, and Müller as its founder. However, there is also another scholar who has a fair claim to be the discoverer of Sogdian. This is F.C. Andreas, who was the first to recognize that Müller's Middle Persian dialect is in fact Sogdian. Both Müller and Andreas were highly gifted linguists who knew a wide range of Oriental languages, but they were very different in their ways of working. One difference between them was that Müller wrote and published swiftly, while Andreas hardly published at all. Much of the work for which Andreas is known was published by his students after his death, and many of his most important discoveries are only known from the publications of other scholars who refer to letters or oral communications from Andreas. It is typical that his identification of Müller's Middle Persian dialect as Sogdian is merely mentioned in passing in a note which he contributed to the second of Müller's articles of 1904. And a little later, in 1907, Müller mentioned in a footnote that Andreas had given a lecture on his discovery at the Academy of Sciences in Göttingen, where he was professor of Oriental philology. It seems, however, that this lecture was never published. In 1908, another footnote by Müller explains for the first time how Andreas had reached his conclusion. He cites an oral communication from Andreas, according to which he based his identification on a comparison between the language of the Manichaean fragments and the Sogdian linguistic material cited by the great Muslim polymath al-Biruni. Biruni, who lived from 973 to 1048 CE, wrote many works in Arabic on scientific and antiquarian subjects. In these works, he often cited technical terms in other languages, including Egyptian, Syriac, and Sanskrit, as well as in various Iranian languages, such as Persian, Sogdian, and Khwarezmian, his own native language. In particular, in his great work on chronology, which was edited and translated by the German scholar Eduard Sachau towards the end of the 19th century, Biruni listed the names of the 12 months and the names of the 30 days of the month in many languages, including Sogdian. Andreas had observed two special features of the Sogdian form cited by Biruni: the change of Old Iranian thr to sh, and the change of h to ch. Since these same phonological developments were found in Müller's Middle Persian dialect, he concluded that this so-called dialect was in fact Sogdian. As Müller pointed out, Andreas' conclusion was fully confirmed by the agreement of the Sogdian month names given by Biruni with those attested in the Manichaean fragments. This was in fact a very strong argument, as only a few of the Sogdian month names have cognate forms in other Iranian calendars. Taken as a whole, the list of month names is unique to Sogdian. Another important contribution by Andreas, which was again made known by his colleagues rather than by Andreas himself, was his discovery that a dialect of Sogdian survives in the Yaghnobi language, which is still spoken today by a small community in the remote valley of the river Yaghnob in Tajikistan. The first specimens of Yaghnobi seem to have been recorded in 1870 by a Russian traveller, A.L. Kuhn. Several other travellers followed in his footsteps and published short vocabularies and paradigms of inflected words in Yaghnobi. Andreas' recognition of the close relationship between Sogdian and Yaghnobi was first made known by Müller in 1907. In a footnote, Müller mentioned some of the agreements in the vocabulary of the two languages which had led Andreas to this conclusion, and adds a few more examples of his own. As in the case of the month names, the argument was very strong, since no Iranian languages other than Sogdian and Yaghnobi share this particular set of words. While Andreas contributed to the development of Sogdian studies by casual remarks which he let drop in letters and conversation, Müller continued to make his mark with a series of more substantial publications. In 1904, while Müller was busy deciphering the Manichaean manuscripts brought to Berlin by the first German Turfan expedition, a second German expedition, led by Albert von Lecoq, had already set out to continue the exploration of the Turfan oasis. In 1905, Lecoq's assistant, Theodor Bartus, had the good luck to unearth a large deposit of Christian manuscripts in Syriac script at the site of Bulaik, 10 kilometers north of Turfan. Nowadays, we know that this site was a Christian monastery. Several photos were sent to Berlin, and a selection of texts were immediately published by Eduard Sachau, the same scholar who had earlier edited and translated Biruni's chronology. Most of the manuscripts published by Sachau were liturgical texts in Syriac, but one was a Sogdian text written in Syriac script. Sachau could not understand more than a few words, but he did recognize that the text was written in the same language as Müller's Middle Persian dialect. In fact, this is an exceptionally difficult text, of which no complete translation appeared until 1985, in the published version of my own doctoral thesis. At that time, the text was still unidentified, but in 2017, it was finally identified by Adrian Pirtea as a Sogdian translation of a work by the famous East Syrian mystic Isaac of Nineveh. Sachau's article of 1905 was the very first publication of a new variety of Sogdian, Christian rather than Manichaean in its content, and written in Syriac rather than Manichaean script. But since the text could not be understood, the publication did not immediately lead to any significant advance in the study of the Sogdian language. Once again, progress came through the work of Müller, who soon found several folios amongst the manuscripts from Bulaik, which contained parts of the New Testament translated into Sogdian from the Syriac Peshitta version of the Bible. Some of these folios were bilingual, with the text presented phrase by phrase, first in Syriac and then in Sogdian. When Müller published the first specimens of these Christian Sogdian biblical texts in 1907, he justifiably described them as the key to the understanding of Sogdian. Since the Syriac language was well understood, and since the translation closely followed the wording of the Syriac, it was possible to be sure of the meaning of almost every word and grammatical form in the Sogdian text. Müller's discovery of the Sogdian biblical text was presented in a lecture at the Academy in Berlin in March 1907. In that same month, Aurel Stein was the first European to visit cave number 17, the so-called library cave at Dunhuang. The cave had been discovered in 1900, and a number of Chinese scrolls, Sanskrit poti leaves, and paintings had already been removed before the time of Stein's visit. But Aurel Stein and Paul Pelliot, who came to Dunhuang in the following year, seem to have been the first to take an interest in the manuscripts in unknown languages, such as Sogdian. The discovery of the Dunhuang library cave added a new dimension to the study of Sogdian. The Sogdian manuscripts from Turfan, which had so far been deciphered and which were already beginning to be published, were all Manichaean and Christian texts, written in either Manichaean or Syriac script. The Sogdian manuscripts from Dunhuang were mostly Buddhist texts translated from Chinese, and they were written in yet another script, the native script of the Sogdian homeland. Nowadays, this script is referred to as the national script, or simply as Sogdian script. This script could be read fairly easily, as it is essentially the same as the script which was still used for writing Uyghur Turkish. Another important difference between the manuscripts from Turfan and the manuscripts from Dunhuang is that the latter are, on the whole, much better preserved. Most of the Turfan texts are fragments, with a few complete folios, but no complete books. Some of the Sogdian manuscripts from Dunhuang contain very substantial texts, with several hundred, even 1,000 lines. A few are actually complete, such as the Sutra of Causes and Effects, which was amongst the first to be published. Stein returned to London with the manuscripts he had obtained from Dunhuang in 1909, but he had considerable difficulty in finding anyone to work on the Sogdian material. At first, the Sogdian scrolls were thought to be in Uyghur Turkish, and photographs were sent to Edward Denison Ross for decipherment. Ross identified the language as Sogdian and volunteered to work on the material, but Stein rejected his offer on the grounds that Ross did not have the necessary expertise. Instead, the work was entrusted to Müller in Berlin. Müller did make some progress, using his knowledge of Chinese to identify Sogdian translations of some well-known Buddhist texts. But no publication resulted from his work until many years later, in part because Müller was preoccupied with his work on the Sogdian and Turkish manuscripts from Turfan. Pelliot was more successful than Stein, obtaining the energetic assistance of a young specialist in Iranian languages, Robert Gautiot. Beginning in 1911, Gautiot published a steady stream of articles based on the Sogdian manuscripts from Dunhuang, which Pelliot had taken to Paris. In one of his first articles, Gautiot discussed the history of the Sogdian alphabet from its Aramaic origin to its later manifestation in the Uyghur cursive script. And the next year, in 1912, he was responsible for the first ever publications of Sogdian Buddhist texts. One was the Dirghanaka Sutra, a short but complete work, the Sogdian version of which was based on an early 8th century Chinese text, as Gautiot was able to establish with the help of the Buddhologist Sylvain Lévy. The other was the Vesantara Jataka, a long narrative text which seems not to be a direct translation from Chinese or any other known original, but a Sogdian retelling of a well-known story, that of one of the Buddha's former lives. As a narrative rather than a doctrinal text, the Vesantara Jataka was comparatively easy to understand even without the aid of a closely parallel text in a better-known language. And since it is a well-preserved text of over 1,800 lines, it provided for the first time a substantial sample of natural Sogdian syntax, without the distortions introduced by the translators of the Christian texts in their efforts to preserve the exact wording of the Syriac Bible. If we may take 1904, the date of the first publication of a Sogdian text, as marking the beginning of the rediscovery of Sogdian, the first decade of Sogdian studies may be said to end with the printing of the first part of Gautio's Sogdian grammar in 1913 to 1914. Only a few copies of this work had been distributed in 1914 when the First World War broke out. As a result, the volume was not widely distributed until 1923. So the book bears the official publication date 1914 to 1923. Nevertheless, it was actually written in 1913. The fact that it was possible to compose such a work in that year, less than 10 years after the publication of the first short Sogdian text, shows how quickly the field had developed within that time. Well, so far I have spoken of the discovery and decipherment of Sogdian texts in Manichaean script, in Syriac script, and in the native Sogdian script. But all of these texts belong to a quite late period in the history of Sogdian, mainly the 8th and 9th centuries. By that time, however, we know that Sogdian had already been written for many centuries. So now I am turning to the second part of my talk, which is devoted to the oldest Sogdian inscriptions and documents. The earliest substantial documents are the so-called ancient letters, discovered in 1907 by Aurel Stein at a ruined watchtower on the frontier wall guarding the route between China and Central Asia. It's known as T12A, and you can see it marked with a little cross on the map. These texts are both the earliest and the most important Sogdian sources concerning the activities of the Sogdian merchants in China. The letters were written by members of the Sogdian merchant colonies in Western China, at least one of them in Guzhang and 2 in Dunhuang. The only one which bears an address was sent to Samarkand, far away to the west. Some others may have been destined for Lolan or other places on the route between Dunhuang and Samarkand. There's no direct evidence as to why the postbag containing the letters was abandoned, but the most obvious supposition would be that it was confiscated for security reasons by the border guards. The second letter, which is by far the longest, contains several references to contemporary events in China, to a severe famine in the capital Luoyang, as a result of which the emperor had fled from the city, to fighting between the Huns and the Chinese, and to the destruction of Luoyang. From these and other details, it is clear that the letters must have been written within a year or two of the sack of Luoyang in 311 CE. The letters contain much information on the activities of the Sogdian merchants in China at this period, though unfortunately many details are obscure as the result of linguistic difficulties and the poor state of preservation of the texts. Only a few of the commodities traded are clearly identifiable. They include gold, musk, pepper, camphor, cloth made of hemp or flax, and wheat. It used to be said that silk is not mentioned in the ancient letters. If that were correct, it must be due to the limited extent of the text, since there is no doubt that silk played an important role in the East-West trade at this period, even if the concept of the Silk Road was not invented until the 19th century. But it seems likely that silk is in fact referred to by the previously unknown term pirchik, which occurs twice in letter number 6, the one you see here. This, and I quote, "If you go to Lolan, you should buy pirchik for me in exchange for it. And if you do not find any pirchik, you should buy camphor in exchange for it and bring it to me." Professor Scherver of Harvard, who was the first to make sense of this passage, plausibly suggested that pirchik may designate a type of fabric. If so, it seems likely that its first syllable is identical with the Khotanese word pira, which means worm, especially silkworm. The addition of the common suffix cheek would give in the first place an adjective meaning derived from the silkworm, hence as a noun, silk thread or silk cloth. The ancient letters mention Sogdians in Dunhuang, Sichuan, Guzhang, and Luoyang. In some places, the Sogdians were apparently present in considerable numbers. One passage refers to 100 freemen from Samarkand, but the name of the place where this community was established is unfortunately lost. On the sketch map, you can see all these places, Luoyang, Guzhang, Sichuan, and Dunhuang. And note also the position of Luolan or Carolina to the west, which I shall mention in a moment.
Gelsin yetmezden prema aylantırasan, sonra 3'le geçe ekskursiyanı tuyatıp keyin etip koyasan gelsin ama aytip koyaman ujini o'sha yerda bo'ladi.
Can you still hear me? Because I seem to have gone over to the Russian channel.
Keyin soat ön takam 5'te
Cahangir aka mikrofonni o'chiring.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Though Chinese sources do not mention Zoroastrian temples in China before the Tang, the reference to a temple priest suggests that the Sogdians in Dunhuang may have had their own temple or shrine. The use of Sogdian titles, which may mean leader and counselor, suggests that this colony may even have been to some extent self-governing. These three titles are all attested in a pair of letters, letters number 1 and number 3, both of which were written by a woman named Miu Nai, one to her mother Chatis and the other to her husband Nanaithat. In these letters, Miu Nai complains that her husband has abandoned her in Dunhuang for 3 years. She details her approaches to the leaders of the Sogdian community and her efforts to find someone who would take her to join her husband or her mother. Since all these efforts are unsuccessful, she has to accept charity from the temple priest, and she and her daughter are forced to become servants to the Chinese. It is not surprising that Miu Nai is angry with her husband, as she makes clear in letter number 3. I quote, "I obeyed your command and came to Dunhuang, and I did not observe my mother's bidding, nor that of my brothers. Surely the gods were angry with me on the day when I did your bidding. I would rather be a dog's or a pig's wife than yours." A notable feature of the letters is the existence of close connections between the Sogdian merchants and the Indians. The two groups are directly linked in a passage which contains the grim news that when they reached Luoyang, the Indians and Sogdians there had all died of starvation. This is letter 2. The antiquity of this association is indicated by the use of many Indian loanwords, especially terms connected with trade, such as caravan, price, and prastak, which is a unit of measure. It has been suggested that the Indians referred to in the letters are people from the kingdom of Shanshan or Lolan, where a large number of documents in an Indian language and script have been found. This is very plausible, especially since one letter refers specifically to going to Lolan to trade. The addressee of letter number 1, the mother of the abandoned wife, is a woman named Chatis, a name which is also attested in these Indian documents in Kharoshthi script. A few fragmentary Sogdian documents have been found in the lowland area, including 2 fragments of letters very similar in writing and contents to the ancient letters, and presumably of similar date. One of these is another letter from a wife to her husband, in which she voices the same complaint as Miu Nai in the letter I mentioned before. She has written her husband again and again, but she never receives any reply. While the Indians who are associated with the Sogdian merchants in the ancient letters could have been inhabitants of Lolan, there is good reason to think that the Sogdian merchants who operated in Western and Central China might also have had the opportunity of making contact with Indian merchants in India itself. In recent decades, more than 600 short Sogdian inscriptions have been found at sites on either bank of the river Indus in northern Pakistan. Most of them, like the one you see here, contain just the names and patronymics of Sogdian visitors to the region, probably merchants who had come to northern India to barter their goods. Paleographical criteria suggest that most of the Sogdian inscriptions are not much later than the ancient letters and belong to about the 4th to 6th centuries CE. Probably most of these Sogdians came to India from Samarkand and other places in the Sogdian homeland, but at least one Sogdian visitor left an inscription in which he refers specifically to a forthcoming journey north to Tashkurgan in the west of Xinjiang. So it seems certain that the Sogdians were involved in the trade between China and India, as well as between China and the West. The ancient letters, which I was discussing just now, were found as long ago as 1907, in the first years of the rediscovery of Sogdian. The last group of texts I want to discuss did not come to light until almost a century later. It was in February 2006 that I first heard from Franz Grenet of the discovery in southern Kazakhstan of several fragments of baked clay bricks or plaques with inscriptions in an alphabet of Aramaic origin. All of them come from the excavations led by Professor Alexander Pudushkin at the site of Kultobe in the valley of the river Aras on the territory of the ancient state referred to in Chinese sources as Kangju. The first inscribed fragment was found in 1996, and since then the excavations have continued almost every year. 27 fragments have been found so far. The existence of writing at the site of Kultobe was first made known in 2000 in Pudushkin's book on the Aris culture of this region. At that time, 2 inscribed fragments were known. The first, the one shown on the cover of the book, was excavated in 1992. The second had been found earlier and was preserved in a small local museum. A third fragment, K3, was discovered during excavations in 2002, followed by further fragments in 2005. The most important of these is the one you see here, K4, which contains a much longer text, though it is clearly incomplete on the left side. When I first learned of the existence of these inscriptions in 2006, 8 fragments were known. In 2007, I published a preliminary decipherment accompanied by remarks on the historical context by Franz Grenet. Later in the same year, Grenet, Pudushkin, and I made a joint presentation in Paris, and by the time it was published in 2009, the number of fragments had grown to 12. Only 2 of the fragments known at this time were sufficiently well preserved to be translated. The first is K2, which contains a short but almost complete text. The translation which I published in 2007 is shown on this slide. The only point in which I now have to change that translation concerns the word Sparthni. Etymologically, this word is a title meaning general, literally army leader. In the translation you see here, I understood this word to be used as a title, referring to the military leader of the people of Charch, that is, the region of Tashkent. However, it has now become clear, as we shall see, that the title Sparthni is attested in another Kultobe text as a personal name. It therefore seems likely that it is a personal name in this text too, giving the revised translation which you see here. The other text, which was sufficiently well preserved to be interpreted, was the longer fragment K4. This was more difficult because every line is incomplete. However, part of the text is quite repetitive and formulaic, using a fixed wording to list the lords of 4 cities of central and southern Sogdiana. The formulaic wording made it possible to propose an almost certain restoration of the missing words at the end of line 4, the text in red on this slide, and thus to estimate the approximate amount of text missing at the end of the other lines too. But it was impossible to guess the exact words to be restored in the other lacunae of this inscription. This is the interpretation of the first half of the inscription which I offered in 2007. Line 3 contains 2 crucial words which were previously unknown. The first is Withan Narf, which I took to mean nomads, literally tent people, compound of the words Withan, tent, and Narf, people. Here it seems to contrast with the simple Narf, people, in the same line, suggesting that the latter refers to the people who are not nomadic, that is, the settled population. The second crucial word is chalik, which I took to be an Aramaic word meaning allotted, or what is allotted, here used as a logogram, standing for a Sogdian word of the same meaning. The transcription in capital letters is a convention used by Iranists for indicating the Aramaic logograms, which, as you see, are very numerous in these texts. So something was perhaps allotted or shared out between the 2 groups of people, the nomads and the people of the city. But unfortunately, it's not clear what was allotted. My translation, allotted land, was just a guess. Here now is the second part of the text, insofar as it was known in 2006. As I already explained, lines 4 to 5 contain a list of the lords of 4 Sogdian cities. Easily recognizable are Samarkand and Nakhshap, medieval Nasaf, modern Kashi. The identification of Kesh, modern Shahrisabz, and Nabak Maithan, an ancient name of Bukhara, looks more speculative, but it was supported by another fragmentary inscription in which these 2 place names appear one above the other, just as in the text we are looking at. So the fragment on the left is the very first to be found. Later on, the fragment on the right was excavated, showing the same 2 names, one above the other. Finally, the text of the longer fragment seems to tell us that someone took all the treasure, as well as what was allotted. It is not clear whether the subject of the verb is singular or plural. It might be the army leader who took all the treasure, or it might be the lords of the 4 cities. There was no way to tell. Despite various elements of uncertainty, these inscriptions already provided some significant information regarding the history of the region. The inscriptions cannot be dated exactly, but it seems certain from archaic features of their writing and language that they predate the Sogdian ancient letters of the early 4th century by some considerable time, perhaps by a century or more. In any case, they must belong to the period when Chinese sources describe the region as belonging to the state or confederation known as Kangju, a name which derives from that of Kanka, the ancient capital of Charch to the south of Tashkent. Quite unexpected is the clear evidence that the rulers of the chief cities of central and southern Sogdiana, with the aid of the people of Charch, mounted a military campaign to the north, founding at least 1 city and possibly settling an agricultural community in an area previously controlled by the nomads. In the following years, Professor Podushkin continued his excavations at Kultove, finding further inscriptions. These included the 2 you see here, K12 and K14, which turned out to be precise duplicates of K2, the short but complete text claiming ownership of the city for the people of Charch. That is easily consistent with the interpretation of this text as a statement of ownership. Such a statement might well have been duplicated many times and displayed at various places, perhaps at the city gates. On the other hand, K13 turned out to be a duplicate or a near duplicate of the longer inscription K4, though it differs in its layout and, more importantly, in the fact that the 4 Sogdian cities are apparently named in a different order, with Samarkand second rather than first. Possibly, this variation was intended to give equal status to the various cities, but that's just a guess. At this point, having seen that several of the plaques bear duplicates or near duplicate texts, I began to wonder whether this might also apply to some or all of the smaller fragments. I discussed this possibility in a lecture which I presented at a conference in London in 2017, by which time 16 fragments were known. In my paper, I showed that 7 fragments could be interpreted as being duplicate copies of the ownership inscription, K2, all of them showing exactly the same layout. The case of the longer text was more complicated. Since the text of K4, the best preserved example, is incomplete, words occurring in the smaller fragments but not in K4 may belong to the part which is broken off at the left end. In particular, 2 words in the fragments seem likely to belong to the part of the text which is missing in K4. Near the beginning of the inscription, we have a verb meaning killed, attested in 2 fragments, and near the end, a word which I tentatively interpreted as parkoda, commander, which is attested in another 2 fragments. In my lecture, I presented the reconstruction of the text which you see here, based on K4 and 8 smaller fragments. The words and letters underlined are those which are not in K4, but supplied from the other copies. In 2020, while my 2017 lecture was still in press, a further plaque, K19, containing a complete or almost complete copy of the longer text, was unearthed during the continuing excavations at Kultove. I was happy, of course, to discover that the new copy confirmed a number of my previous conjectures and reconstructions. In particular, it confirmed my estimate of the amount of text missing from the right-hand end of K4, and the fact that some words found only on the smaller fragments, such as the verb killed, do indeed belong to this text. At the same time, the new copy created new problems and showed that some solutions which have previously appeared plausible cannot be correct. After this discovery, the only part of the text which could not be clearly read was the very last word, but this problem was solved 1 year later by the discovery of 2 further fragments containing the left-hand end of the inscription. Here, the last word is clearly legible as Rotami, a known Sogdian word meaning family. So finally, in 2021, we had a complete and legible version of the whole text. The new complete text makes it possible to improve the understanding of several points. The first is that the word Sparthni, army leader, is not used as a title, but as a personal name. This is quite certain because it is followed by the Aramaic word for name, here no doubt used as a logogram for the Sogdian equivalent Nam. Thus, the first sentence can now be translated, this city was built by the son of the leader of the people of Charch, Sparthni by name. The same change must no doubt be applied to the shorter inscription, as I mentioned earlier. In both inscriptions, it is necessary to assume that Charchan Nafch is not merely an adjective meaning belonging to the people of Charch, but that it is used as a noun implying leader of the people of Charch. The same usage is attested a little later on some coins of Charch, as Professor Lifshitz recognized long ago. The wording of the longer inscription is perhaps ambiguous. This city was built by the son of the leader of the people of Charch, Sparthni by name. Is Sparthni the name of the leader of the people of Charch or the name of his son? I think the latter is more likely, as it would be strange not to mention the name of the city's founder. If this is correct, the shorter inscription, which identifies Sparthni himself as the leader of the people of Charch, should date from a little later, when Sparthni has inherited or has been appointed to the position formerly held by his father. The second sentence of the long inscription may be translated, he went here when the Ipdhipch was killed. Since we have no idea who Ipdhipch was, or even whether the word is a name or a title, this is quite obscure. Possibly Ipdhipch was an enemy killed in an earlier phase of the military campaign, the establishment of the settlement at Kultobe being the consequence of this success. Another possible explanation is that Ipdhipch was an envoy of the people of Charch, and that Sparthni came to this area on a punitive expedition after he had been killed by some enemy. But all this is mere speculation. Next comes the passage which I previously interpreted as referring to a sharing of territory between the nomads and the Sogdian colonists. That interpretation has to be abandoned, since it is now clear that the word Halik must refer to a person, like the word Lord in the following phrases. In this context, it seems likely that the expression Naf Halik means something like people's representative. While each of the cities of Sogdiana was ruled by a lord, the nomads and the people of Charch apparently had a different form of political organization, perhaps involving the election of a representative. The inscription ends with a phrase referring to yet another people's representative, this time of an unidentified group. Finally, the fact that we now have a complete text of 2 inscriptions means that we can be sure that some fragments definitely do not belong to either of them, but must represent at least one other text. The fragments concerned are K3, K23, K26, and perhaps K17. It seems possible, though not certain, that all 4 belong to a single text. Here I give a partial reconstruction of the text using a different color for the letters preserved on each of the fragments. Unfortunately, only a few letters are preserved from the first 2 lines, but the latter part of the text seems to contain a variant list of those who took the treasure, ending rather than beginning with the Lord of Samarkand. Well, although the interpretation of the Kultobe inscriptions remains uncertain in many details, they portray the Sogdians very differently from the ancient letters, as warriors or colonists rather than as merchants. Clearly, the lords of the four major cities of central and western Sogdiana are depicted as supporting in some way a military expedition led by the people of Charch, that is, Kanka or Kangju. Until recently, almost all our information about Kangju was based on the statements in Chinese annals, such as the Hanshu. Now these statements can be compared with first-hand information from the Kultobe inscriptions, as well as a growing body of archaeological data from Pudushkin's excavations in southern Kazakhstan. In addition, as I know from a paper by my collaborator, Professor Bibo, there is important contemporary information concerning Kangju in some wood slips like these found at the Chuanjuan site near Dunhuan, which was a postal station at the time which we are concerned with. In various ways, these wood slips confirm the accuracy of the Chinese chronicles, for instance, regarding embassies to the Han court from Kangju. One text mentions envoys from Kangju together with envoys from Suxie, that is, Sogdiana, which is also mentioned in the Hanshu as the first of the 5 lesser kingdoms subject to Kangju. Although the identification of the 5 lesser kingdoms is quite problematic, it is very tempting to follow Bibo's suggestion of comparing them with the Sogdian city-states listed in the Kultobe inscription. At any rate, we now have contemporary and indigenous sources which will need to be taken into account by historians in their attempts to reconstruct the reality underlying the reports on Kangju in the Chinese historical literature. So in ending this summary of the earliest Sogdian texts, the Kultobe inscriptions and the ancient letters, I hope you will forgive me for drawing your attention to my new edition of all these texts, which has just appeared. It's a blatant advertisement, I admit, but I do thank you for your attention.